when you look at the literature review, I essentially said there are basically three schools of thought when we're looking at the broader Lutheran landscape, and I don't deal with every kind of theological movement today in reaction to scholasticism.
You can't.
Because you can't, right? So we also have the kind of theology of hope with Jürgen Moltmann and Robert Jensen, Wolfhard Pannenberg, and those will be dealt with in further volumes in the series, especially as I deal with the doctrine of God, because they're critics of scholasticism too, but from a different kind of approach. But what I deal with is the radical Lutheran approach. So these are figures like Gerhard Forde, Stephen Paulson, and Oswald Bayer. I name as the three kind of main proponents of this. And there are differences between each of those three figures. But there's kind of a united theology in some ways, and united assumptions and arguments against what is the more traditional Lutheran scholastic method. And an argument that essentially says that Luther's theology, especially the early Luther, who really is where they draw a lot of their arguments from, but that Luther's theology is antithetical to the development of Lutheranism post-Reformation. So that's the argument of those figures, right? So there are those who say complete discontinuity between Luther and post-Reformation era theology.
Yeah, so they're alike in their rejection of Aristotelian metaphysics.
Right. They're alike in their rejection of classical metaphysics generally. So that includes both Plato and Aristotle. Right. And what they draw on is, this is something that happens in the 20th century through one of the most prominent theological liberals who has a series of books on the history of doctrine, Adolf von Harnack. And Harnack argues for what's been called the Hellenizing thesis. And in the Hellenizing thesis, it's argued that there was a more pure Christianity that arose in the first century, and gradually the fathers started kind of Hellenizing that, or bringing in these Greek elements of Greek philosophy and thought that kind of distorted theology from that time forward. So what you have in a lot of 20th century theology generally is that there is this assumption of this kind of Hellenization, an assumption that that's bad. So this happens in numerous areas of scholarship. I mean, you can look at just Pauline scholarship and see how this has completely impacted the way that Paul's been read. But in terms of historical theology, that's happened through this dichotomy between Luther on the one hand and then later Lutheranism on the other. You see this with Karl Hohl and the Luther Renaissance and others, going back to even Ritschl in the 19th century, who makes this strong split and divide between those two. And so what you have is this assumption that you have the pure theology of Luther and then the kind of overly philosophical, distorted Lutheranism post-Luther.
Okay, so that's the first group.
So that's the first group,
okay.
Yes. So then you have the second group, which is those who are favorable to Protestant scholasticism, right? So I name specifically two people that are the most important in this area. And one is from the Reformed tradition, one's from the Lutheran. So from the Reformed tradition, Richard Muller. Richard Muller has this multi-volume work dealing with post-Reformation Reformed dogmatics, and it's a fantastic work. It's been hugely influential. He's at Calvin, and I believe there's a new edition of those coming out as well. They were out of print for a while. I don't know if the volumes are still out of print. I know you can get them on Logos. But so he's argued essentially from a Reformed perspective, and he's dealing with the more Calvin versus the Calvinists thesis, which is you have the same thing within both traditions, which is essentially the same argument, right? Which is the Reformers are here, the scholastic era is here, and there's this huge divergence between the two. So Muller has argued, no, let's go back to look at the primary sources. And when you do, this divide is, I mean, yes, there are differences in terms of presentation especially, but this divide has been very much exaggerated. So the same happens in Lutheranism with Robert Preuss and his 2 volumes on post-Reformation Lutheranism. And Preuss has also dealt with this in articles, and he's got a book on the inspiration of Scripture in the Lutheran Scholastics, and he's got a volume, Justification in Rome, dealing with what is the developed Lutheran doctrine of justification contrasted with the Roman view. I mean,
so if you're interested in that would be a good book to look at.
Yes, excellent. I mean, Preuss is excellent, and yeah, if you look at Preuss's work, he's highly recommended. So he's one who I've drawn on a lot in a lot of these areas. So Preuss and Muller have essentially done the same thing. In that Preuss has said, hey, let's not throw out this entire post-Reformation period. There's a lot of great wisdom that we can gain from these people. And, Preuss is still critical of certain aspects of the development of theology. He's not saying we completely just, take Johannes Quenstedt and just repeat everything he said. But let's take these as a foundation and let's start reading these sources again, because they're very valuable sources that we can really gain a lot of good from. So those are the two figures that I cite. But there are others, and there's some of this is just seen in terms of the publications today. I mean, there's a renewed interest in publishing figures of this era. So within the Reformed tradition, I mean, you had, when Francis Turretin's Institutes of Elenctic Theology was published, that kind of started this whole trajectory of like, let's get all the Reformed scholastics published in English now. And then a Concordia Publishing House started publishing the works of Johann Gerhard. You have Repristination Press that's putting out a number of these figures. And, we're trying to contribute to this by putting out especially some of the American thinkers that have been lost within the Lutheran tradition, who were following after those scholastics. And what I think you really find in a lot of the 19th century figures, as you look at a Henry Esther Jacobs or Revere Franklin Widener or others, is they serve as such a good model of how to use this theology, because what they do is they grab onto the theology of those figures, but they're not just republishing or just repeating. They're applying it to a modern context in modern questions. And they're open to looking at areas of development from where they were at, but using them as a foundation. So there are those figures who are more in the scholastic, in favor of scholasticism. And then you have the third category.
This is the one that I'm particularly interested in asking about.
Yes.
Because I think that this is a little bit more tricky. You have the outright rejection, you have the outright support with some development, ability to develop, but this mediating view. So I'm interested just to have you talk a little bit about them too.
Yeah, and that's what you find has really, I think, kind of predominated, is this mediating view. Predominated in more, I would say, more conservative theologically. I mean, more conservative, seminaries, both within the Lutheran and Reformed traditions, which is that there is an adoption of many of the fundamental criticisms of the older scholastic method, while the confessions of those particular traditions are still held to by those theologians. So the two things are kind of mixed together. I mean, if you look at the Reformed tradition, a good example of this would be someone like a John Frame. And if you look at James Dolezal, who is a Reformed Baptist, who's written a bit on classical doctrine of God, he has a book where he's demonstrated that this is kind of predominated even evangelicalism and conservative Reformed evangelicalism, is they've grabbed onto a lot of these assumptions that everyone got it wrong kind of after the Reformation by adopting what is a Hellenized view of God. And you find this within the Lutheran tradition then in even, Lutheran seminaries using a lot of the ideas of someone like a Gerhard Forde, but also kind of trying to combine those with what is a classical confessional Lutheran theology. And my argument is it doesn't work. You can't do it, because what you're doing is you're not addressing what are those core fundamental differences ideologically that serve as the root of someone like Forde's theology. You can't just kind of pick and choose what you want out of his theology as if it's not tied to his fundamental assumptions.